Well, first of all, I just wanted to say it's a joy to be with you here today in this role. Some of you know that I was pastor at St. Andrew for a number of years. I retired there 3 years ago. But since that was Adrian's home congregation, I got to know her quite well. And I can say that you are probably, as you know, very fortunate to have her as a pastor. She's a pastor of great faith, deep compassion, wonderful enthusiasm, and a great commitment to justice. But I think what's really more important is that she's really fortunate to have you as a congregation. She kind of brags about you, you know, about how supportive you've been and how you are willing just to jump in there with her and really make a difference by sharing God's love with this community and this world. And I thank you for that. Grace, peace, and joy be with you from the God of all love and compassion. So I'm wondering, do you ever feel like that bent-over woman in today's gospel lesson, weighed down by all your troubles, the worries of the world, just all the issues surrounding us? You ever feel kind of weighed down like that? Yeah. Anybody willing to share maybe one thing that weighs you down, burdens you? Jeff? Anxiety. Oh, that's a good one. Anything? What? Physical limitation, that's another good one, yes. Anyone worried about the rise of white supremacy? Yeah, things like that, the immigration situation. I got a whole long list of them. Global warming, fires in the Amazon. Yeah, so we could go on and on, listing all those problems in our world, because we know that our world is one that is very burdened. It's full of problems and evils and sin. And so at times, all this can be very overwhelming, and we feel like that woman in our gospel lesson, crippled in spirit, if not also in body. Well, this gospel reading from today's this gospel reading from today reminds me of a story I once heard from a woman named Fran, who was an ELCA church executive. And this is a story about her childhood, where she was crippled in spirit. You see, Fran was born during the Great Depression, and she lost her parents shortly after birth, so she was an orphan, and she was placed in a Baptist orphanage. And because this was a Great Depression, people didn't have enough money to adopt children. And so what happened is that these orphans were placed in a series of foster homes for limited periods of time. Well, Fran ended up living in 12 different foster homes when she was growing up. And each of these homes bestowed on her their favorite name for a little girl. In one place she would be Margaret. In another place she would be Sally. One home called her Betty, and another home called her Mary. Well, the family gave her these names out of love. They didn't realize how emotionally crippling it could be for a child to be called by so many different names. And of course, this was very confusing for Fran as well, because she never knew if she was Eunice or if she was Lois. Well, one day when Fran was 11, she was back in the orphanage. And the custodian saw her crying on the steps. "What's wrong, Kathy?" the custodian said, using her current name. And this little girl replied through her tears, "Well, I just don't know who I am anymore. Everybody calls me something different." Well, the custodian knew that Fran was to be baptized soon in the Baptist church. And I just have to say practices of the Baptist church are a little bit different than our practices. In that Baptist church, they baptized when children were 12 years old, because that was the age that Jesus was when he was found teaching in the temple. But Fran really wanted to be baptized. And so the pastor told her, well, if you memorize 100 Bible verses, and they can't be those little ones like Jesus wept, if you memorize 100 Bible verses, we will baptize you early. Well, Fran did it. She baptized those 100 Bible verses, and she was about to be baptized, and the custodian knew this. So the custodian said to that sobbing little girl, "Kathy, don't you know that whatever name they baptize you with is a name that Jesus knows you by? Don't you know that whatever name they baptize you with is a name that Jesus knows you by?" While hearing this, Kathy decided that she was going to be baptized as Frances because she had heard that was a name that her birth mother had given her. Well, since this was a Baptist church, she was immersed in this big tub of water for her baptism. And she went down in that water, a crippled little girl, crippled in spirit because of all this different identities, all this change in her life. But she went down in that water, and she died with Christ, and she was raised with Christ to a new identity. When she came out of that water, she was Frances, child of God. Well, you can just imagine that after her baptism, Fran walked a little taller with more confidence because she knew that no matter what life threw at her, she would always be loved and cared for by God. She would always be Frances, child of God. So after baptism, Frances decided that whatever foster home she went to, she wouldn't respond to any name but Frances, because that was a name that Jesus knew her by. Well, like Frances, the woman in today's gospel lesson found freedom and healing in her encounter with Jesus. This woman had been bent over for 18 long years. For 18 years, she could only see her feet. She couldn't look anyone in the eye. And we can imagine she didn't have a lot of self-esteem or a lot of dignity. She might have been shunned by her community. Maybe she was even considered unclean because of her ailment. Well, she appears in the synagogue where Jesus is teaching. We don't even know if she's really supposed to be there. But she appears in the synagogue, and Jesus sees her. And Jesus touches her, and Jesus tells her, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." And he also gives her a name of dignity. He calls her daughter of Abraham. We might say daughter of Abraham and Sarah. But the point is that when he calls her daughter of Abraham, he is connecting her to those beloved ancestors of the Jewish faith. So this woman found healing in Jesus, but as is often the case, this healing had some repercussions for Jesus. Just like Fran upset some of her foster parents by not responding when they called her Kathy, when they wanted her to come to dinner, Jesus upsets the leader of the synagogue with his healing. The leader, after Jesus does his healing, tells the crowd over and over again that the Sabbath is a day of rest, a day where you don't work. And healing is work. So Jesus was working on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus, like a good rabbi, responds by asking, "But don't you free your animals on the Sabbath and lead them to water? So shouldn't this woman, who is more important than animals, be set free on the Sabbath?" Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and he declares in his words and actions that the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. This gospel passage reminds us that our Sabbath times, our worship services, are meant to be places of healing, where we remember that we are named and claimed by Jesus through the waters of baptism. We are given the name child of God. And in worship, we are nourished at the table. We are fed with the bread and the wine so that we can love God and serve our neighbor. Our worshiping community is a place where we can come for prayer, for community, for support, so that we can know and experience God's will for the world, which is healing and wholeness and freedom. And as we pointed out earlier, with all our woes, Our world is a broken place, and it is desperately in need of the healing and wholeness and freedom that Jesus has to offer, and that we experience here every single Sunday when we gather to worship and hear God's words and participate in the sacraments. And like Fran and that woman that Jesus healed, I'm sure you have many stories to tell about how people have experienced God's grace and healing in this place. I don't know your particular stories, so I'm going to share with you one story that took place at St. Andrew Church recently. There's a woman there named Lynadell, and she gave me permission to share a bit about herself. Lynadell's been going to St. Andrew for a number of years. She's very active. She's got a wonderful smile and great enthusiasm. But she also experiences a developmental disability, which leads to some challenges in her life. Her mother died maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and so for the past few years, Lynadell has been living with her dad, who has some challenges of his own. Well, her dad died earlier this month, and Lynadell didn't even have money to cover his funeral expenses. But the community of St. Andrew rallied around Lynadell. They had a special appeal, and soon they had enough to cover those expenses. And then they all came together in worship to the memorial service for Lynadell's dad to support and surround Lynadell with love. But that's not all. Lynadell needs help now tending to her dad's estate. She needs help navigating her way through the developmental disability system and also through Social Security. And it's things that she can't do on her own. She doesn't have a whole lot of support right now. And so St. Andrew has lifted up a group of people who have surrounded Lynadell and now meet with her regularly to help her navigate these complex systems, and to even go with her, walk with her as she heads to all these various appointments that she needs to go to. Well, what makes this all a little bit more poignant for me is that I have an adult son with a developmental disability. And it gives me great comfort to know that he will have a community to walk with him after my husband and I are gone. That's the healing that our communities can provide. Well, as you know, our world is full of bent-over people, weighed down by the worries, the cares, the problems of this world. And they need to know that they are God's beloved children. They need to know the help, the hope, the help, the healing that can come from worshiping God together. And I suspect each of you have a story to tell of how you have experienced or witnessed this healing and hope. And maybe there is someone that God is calling you to share this story with. And maybe, just maybe, when you share this story, this may be the nudge that person needs in order to come and experience Christ's healing and wholeness for themselves in this place. Amen.